The day my brother sold the land, the air was brittle with frost. I remember the sound more than the sight, the crunch of frozen grass under my boots, the way each step cracked like glass. I was out by the fence line, surveying the post I'd set straight 2 summers before, when old Dennis drove up in his dented Chevy and rolled the window halfway down. He didn't take off his cap, didn't smile, didn't even look me full in the eye. "You here, Rich?" he said, voice gravelly as the road he'd come down. "Your brother signed it. Land's gone." He didn't linger for my reaction, just lifted 2 fingers from the steering wheel and drove on, leaving exhaust hanging in the cold like smoke from a fire that had burned too long. I stood there a while, the field stretching out before me, rows of corn stalks dead and brittle, the ridge of trees at the far end etched sharp against a pale sky. My breath fogged in the air, and for a moment I thought of my father, how he used to stand in this very spot, sighting the line with a transit while I held the rod steady. His voice came back to me, as clear as if the frost itself carried it. "You don't move a line, son, you find it, and once you found it, you honor it." Now the line had been erased. Not by storm, not by time, but by my own blood. It wasn't until late afternoon that Mark came himself. He didn't bother with shame. He pulled up in a new truck, shiny paint catching the weak winter sun, and stepped out wearing a leather jacket stiff enough to creak when he moved. His boots were clean, too clean for a man who claimed to farm. "Finally did it, Rich," he said, smirking, the kind of smirk that begged to be slapped but wasn't worth the energy. "Signed the deal this morning. Some developer boys think this patch is worth more than you and I ever made off it. Good riddance, I say. You ought to thank me." Thank him! That was my brother all over. Always confusing greed with wisdom, mockery with strength. He'd never tilled this soil, never sweated in the August heat to keep the corn alive, never patched a fence by lantern light while cattle pressed against it. Yet here he stood, crowing like he'd done me a favor. I didn't answer. I kept my hands in my pockets, let the cold bite into my fingers. Silence was my shield, and he mistook it, as he always had, for weakness. "You're free now," he went on, laughter bubbling up, sharp and careless. "No more wasting your days on dirt that don't pay. Maybe you can finally get yourself a hobby. Take up fishing, or reading those dusty ledgers you love so much." I turned my head slowly, looked past him at the horizon. The sky was turning copper, the sun sinking low. Everything around us glowed with that dying light, the kind that makes even dead stalks look holy for a breath. When I finally spoke, my words came low, steady. "You laugh now, Mark, but laughter doesn't keep a man warm come winter." He waved it off, climbed back into his truck. "Don't be dramatic, big brother. This is progress. Get with it." Then he gunned the engine, spitting gravel as he roared away, leaving me with nothing but silence and the bitter smell of exhaust. I walked the fence line after he left. My boots cracked through the frost, and my hand brushed the tops of the posts, rough and splintered, each one a scar I'd tended myself. At the far corner, I stopped where the old stone wall began, the one my grandfather had laid by hand, stone by stone, each rock hefted from the earth with sweat and purpose. I bent down, picked up one of those stones, flat and heavy in my palm. It felt cool, solid, honest, unlike the paper my brother had signed that morning, unlike the laugh he left behind. I whispered then, not a curse, not a prayer, but a promise only the earth and I would hear. He will not have the last laugh. That night, I sat at my kitchen table. The oil lamp hissed softly, throwing long shadows across the wood. Beside me lay my father's old ledger, its leather cracked, the ink faded but firm. I opened the drawer and pulled out the papers I'd kept: deeds, tax receipts, boundary maps, proof of a life lived honest, proof of years spent keeping what was ours. I laid them out one by one, smoothing the edges, my hand steady, even as my chest burned. Paper has always been my weather. Some men read clouds, others read cattle. I read ink, and ink never lies, not if you know how to follow it. Mark thought he'd ended me with a signature. What he didn't understand was that signatures can cut both ways. I lit another lamp, poured coffee so strong it bit my tongue, and began reading. The deed transfer was already recorded. Clean, Mark thought. But nothing is ever truly clean. There are always attachments, easements, liens buried like splinters. I read every line, every word. I copied parcel numbers into my notebook, wrote down names I recognized from courthouse gossip. When the night grew thick, I leaned back, eyes burning from lamplight, and closed the ledger. The stone from the wall sat beside it, weighty and certain. I set my palm on it, felt its coolness, and let my mind drift. I remembered a summer day long ago when Mark and I were boys. Father had set the transit at the corner post and told us both to look. See how the world lines up, he'd said. Mark had peeked once, shrugged, and run off to chase something easier. I'd stayed, squinting through the scope until the line came clear. Even then, we were different. He saw shortcuts, I saw lines, and lines, real lines, don't bend for laughter. For 3 weeks, I said nothing. I walked the ridge behind the barn each evening, boots sinking into thawing mud, listening to the creek murmur low and steady. The survey flags sprouted in the field like weeds, red plastic fluttering in the wind. Trucks came and went, men in clean boots pointing at maps on their hoods. I watched from the distance, silent, invisible. In town, I heard whispers. At the diner, men muttered over coffee. Mark sold out. At church, women shook their heads and said, "Shame, after all those years, Richard kept it afloat." I didn't correct them. Didn't need to. Truth was already working its way through the soil. Mark strutted for a while, telling anyone who listened how smart the deal was, how the money was coming, how I was finally free from dirt. His laugh rang out in the diner, in the bank, on Main Street, but it didn't ring as loud as it used to. People smiled less when he spoke. Their eyes flicked toward me, measuring, weighing. I said nothing, just nodded when nodded to, kept my shoulders straight, my boots steady. Silence was doing my work for me. Then, one bitter morning, I walked into the courthouse. The recorder's office smelled of toner and old paper, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. I asked the young clerk, Ellie. Her name was for the deed transfer on parcel 10437B. She frowned at the screen, printed the pages, clipped them neat. Her eyes lingered on me as if to offer pity. I didn't need pity. I needed paper. I carried the stack to a side table, sat under the hum of lights, and read. There it was, Mark's name, bold, careless. The developers, slick and new, mine absent, erased as if decades of taxes and sweat meant nothing. But deeper in the stack, I found what I was looking for. An old easement signed by Father 27 years ago. Access rights, South Line, Old Creek Road, a sliver of the past that still bound the present. My lips curved just slightly. Not a smile, but a recognition. The line was still there. That night, I cooked stew the way Mother used to carrots, onions, beef that remembered a pasture. I let it simmer until the flavors stopped arguing. Then I carried the stone from the wall to the table, set it on the growing stack of papers, and sat in the glow of the lamp. Outside, wind combed the pines. Inside, silence pressed close, warm, and steady. I thought of Mark's laugh that day, the sharp, cutting sound of a man who believed he'd won. I thought of the field, bare and cold, waiting for spring. I thought of Father's voice. You don't move a line, son, you find it. And I realized Mark hadn't moved the line. He'd only moved himself outside of it. The land, the house, the legacy, everything he thought was his victory, was still bound to the truths he could never understand. And I would be the one to honor them. I leaned back, let the chair creak, and whispered into the silence, "This isn't over." The lamp hissed. The stew steamed. The stone sat heavy on the papers. And in that quiet kitchen, with nothing but shadows for company, I felt something colder, sharper, more certain than rage. I felt patience, and patience, when sharpened by betrayal, cuts deeper than any blade. 3 nights after Mark signed away the land, he called. It was late, too late for casual words. The phone rang steady against the hush of the kitchen, the oil lamp burning low. I let it ring twice before lifting the receiver. "Rich," he said, his voice thick with drink. "We're rich, brother. You don't get it yet, but we are. That land was an anchor, and I cut us loose. You should be thanking me. You'll see." I didn't answer at first. I studied the flame inside the lamp, the way it bowed and swayed with the draft, yet never went out. Finally, I said, "Anchors keep a ship from drifting. He laughed then, a cruel, drunken bark. Always the poet, always clinging to ghosts. "The future doesn't grow in dirt, Rich. It grows in dollars." Then he hung up, leaving me with silence so thick it felt like another presence in the room. The next day, I drove into town. Snowmelt had turned the ruts into mud, and the truck groaned as it climbed the hill toward Main Street. At the post office, a letter waited. The official notice of transfer, black ink on white paper, sterile as a hospital bed. I slid it into my ledger, beneath my father's neat handwriting from years past. I thought of how many times he'd walked this same road to pay taxes. Never late, never careless. He'd believed in permanence. Mark believed in shortcuts. As I stepped outside, the air smelled of thawing earth, damp, metallic, restless. I knew then that spring would not come gently. At the diner, whispers clung to me like smoke. Men hunched over their cups, voices low but not low enough. Sold it right out from under him. Mark always had a nose for quick money. Shame, though. Rich kept that place alive. I ordered coffee, sat at the counter, and said nothing. Silence is a language too, and everyone in that room could hear me speaking it. When I left, I felt their eyes on my back. Some pitying, some respectful, none mocking. That silence was already beginning to bend. That evening, I walked the ridge behind the barn. The pines swayed, creaking in the wind, their shadows long and thin across the snow. From the crest, I could see the survey flags in the field, bright red against the gray soil. They fluttered like warnings, like bloodied cloth. I crouched down, pressed my hand into the cold earth. The soil smelled the same as it had when I was a boy helping father plant beans, rich, damp, alive with promise. I whispered into the wind, "They don't see you, but I do." Days turned into weeks. The developers came more often now, their trucks grinding the road, their laughter sharp, foreign. I stayed out of sight, but I listened. They talked about plans, about breaking ground come spring, about profits that had nothing to do with the land itself. One of them, a young man with a voice like gravel dragged over tin, pointed toward the ridge once. "That old barn's next," he said. His laugh carried across the field. I held my breath, hands clenched in my coat pockets, until they drove off. Rage wanted to rise, but rage is a wasteful fire. I buried it deep, let silence smother it, because silence isn't weakness, it's preparation. At the courthouse, Ellie began to recognize me. "Back again, Mr. Hale?" she asked softly, sliding another file across the counter. "Back again," I said, offering the smallest of smiles. She didn't pry, but I saw in her eyes a glimmer of respect not for what I'd lost, but for the way I carried it. Some men shout their grief. Others build walls with it. It was there, in those quiet stacks of paper, that I began to trace the threads. Mark had signed his name quick, but in his haste he'd left footprints, debts, loans, mortgages balanced on air. I noted them in my ledger, one by one, each entry neat, deliberate. Late payment here, lien recorded there, adjustable interest creeping higher with every quarter. Mark believed he'd won by selling the land, but victory built on sand always sinks. And I was patient enough to watch the tide come in. One night, as Fleet hammered the windows, I dreamed of father again. We were in the field, sun blazing, sweat stinging my eyes. He stood beside me, hands rough, steady on the plow. Mark was there too, leaning against a post, yawning. Father looked at me then, not at him. "The land remembers who honors it," he said, "and who betrays it." I woke with those words burning in my chest. The lamp had gone out, the room was dark, but the stone from the wall was still there on the table, cold beneath my hand. By March, Mark's laughter had changed. It came less often, thinner, edged with something desperate. At the diner, he boasted louder, trying to drown out the whispers. But people looked past him, their eyes finding mine. He noticed, and that ate at him more than any notice tacked to his door ever could. One afternoon, he stormed up to me outside the hardware store. His coat was unbuttoned, his breath sour with drink. "You think you're better than me?" he spat, "walking around like some damn saint while I make us money?" I looked him in the eye, calm, steady. "I don't think, Mark. I know where the lines are, always have." He cursed, shoved past, and stumbled down the street. People watched. No one spoke. That night, I wrote a single sentence in my ledger. The land isn't lost, only misplaced. Because deep down, I knew. Land has a way of coming back to those who respect it. Houses, cars, money, those things drift. But dirt, stone, ridge, and creek, they wait. And I was waiting with them. Spring finally broke. The snow melted, the creek swelled, the fields turned soft underfoot. The developers marked new boundaries, hammering stakes into the soil like they owned it. Mark strutted less now, his shoulders bent, his laugh strained. But I kept silent. I let time do what time always does, reveal. Every evening I returned to the ridge. The pines whispered, the creek sang, and I listened. Patience was my weapon. Silence was my shield. Paper would be my blade. The season had shifted. The betrayal had been made, and the countermove was already stirring beneath the surface, like seeds waiting for rain. Mark thought he had taken everything from me, but in truth, he had only given me reason, and reason, sharpened by silence, is a force no man can escape. I leaned against the barn door that night, stars wheeling overhead, and let the quiet fill me. This isn't the end, I whispered to the dark. It's the beginning. The land heard me. The house would hear me soon. And Mark, in time, would hear me loudest of all, not through words, not through shouts, but through silence that spoke sharper than laughter. When Father died, the land fell heavy on my shoulders. I was 28, already lined from work, while Mark was 20, slick hair, shiny shoes, eyes darting toward anywhere but home. At the graveside, he clapped my back, said, "You've got this, Rich. You always do." Then he left in a borrowed car, and from that day forward, the land was mine to keep alive. I kept it 30 years. I paid every tax bill, even in years when corn prices collapsed, and beans turned yellow before harvest. I patched fences under lightning, shoveled roofs free of snow before they caved. I sold one tractor to keep another alive, went winters with cracked teeth because taxes couldn't wait. Every receipt stacked in my father's old ledger. Every entry a record of survival. Mark, he drifted in on holidays, showed off new watches, cars, stories of big deals in cities. He never asked about taxes, never carried a post for the fence line. To him, the land was a backdrop for boasting. To me, it was oxygen. Mother saw it. Before she passed, she walked the ridge with me, wind tugging her scarf. "Mark thinks money resets the clock," she said. "But clocks don't reset. They swing. And you honor the swing." So I did. While Mark laughed, I endured. The sacrifice wasn't just money. It was life. I never married. No woman wanted to share a bed with debt and broken hands. I never had children, only calves and seasons. My companions were creek water in spring, fence posts leaning in winter, and ledgers written neat when the world felt sloppy. Still, I didn't complain, because I believed silence was duty. But duty can be mistaken for weakness, and weakness invites betrayal. When developers came, Mark's ears pricked up like a hound. They promised quick money. He saw freedom. I saw gravestones. He didn't even consult me, just signed, laughed, and told the world I was finally free of dirt. That laugh cut deeper than any paper. He thought he'd humiliated me, but what he'd really done was give 30 years of sacrifice a new purpose. Because silence as duty is heavy, but silence as weapon, that cuts clean. I sat at the kitchen table that night, stone from the old wall pressing down on my ledger. In the margin, beneath faded ink from my father's hand, I wrote, "The land isn't lost, only misplaced." And with that, the sacrifices of my life stopped being wounds. They became ammunition. Mark thought he'd ended my story. All he'd done was turn the page. Humiliation doesn't strike once, it seeps. By spring, the foreclosure notice was nailed to Mark's door. The sheriff had done his job, but the whole town knew whose name sat on the line marked holder of record. Mark ripped it down, burned it in a coffee can, but you can't burn ink at the courthouse. At the diner, his voice tried to ring out like before. "Clerical mistake," he told a man over eggs. "Got investors coming, nothing to worry about." But when I walked in, his words cracked. His companion excused himself, and suddenly Mark was alone in a booth meant for two. I took my coffee at the counter, didn't look at him, didn't need to. The silence of the room did my speaking. At church it was worse. I got firm handshakes, nods of respect. Mark got thin smiles, quick eyes turned away. He opened his mouth to sing, but his voice cracked on the first verse. He stopped, jaw tight, face red. One neighbor whispered to me afterward, "He's finished." I said nothing. At the courthouse, his shame spilled into marble halls. "The lender is my brother," he shouted, papers shaking in his hands. Everyone turned. Everyone looked from him to me, standing silent with ledger under my arm. I didn't speak. I just nodded once and walked out. His humiliation echoed behind me louder than any curse. From then the spiral quickened. He pawned the boat, the jewelry, even the shotgun that belonged to our grandfather. In small towns, pawning your father's gun is louder than a funeral bell. Neighbors told me his wife wept on the porch, cigarettes glowing in her hand. His kids stopped coming around. At the gas station, I caught his eyes for a flicker, pleading, ashamed, desperate. He dropped them quick, as if eye contact itself was too heavy. He called one night. "We're blood, Rich. You can't do this." I answered steady, "You stopped being my brother the day you sold the land," and laughed. He hung up, and from then on, his laugh was gone. The town judged him not by my words, but by my silence. Every time he raised his voice, the quiet swallowed it. Every deal he bragged about turned hollow. Every lie bounced back against the truth of public record. Humiliation was no longer private. It was the town's story now. And as I sat at my table, Stone pressing the ledger, I realized his downfall didn't require my hand. It only required my patience. Because sometimes revenge isn't a strike. It's watching a man drown in the silence he once mocked. The notice went up on a Wednesday, the kind of morning when the air smells like iron and thawed mud. I was in the diner when the sheriff's truck drifted past the window, a white rectangle of paper sitting on his passenger seat like a folded verdict. He pulled up at Mark's place and did what duty does: no drama, no malice, just a nail, a hammer, and a staple that catches the sun. By noon, the whole town knew. You can hear a foreclosure faster than you hear the noon whistle. I didn't drive by. Dennis did. He told me later, voice low, like naming weather. He ripped it down and burned it in a coffee can, he said. But the smoke didn't change a thing. Paper burns. The record doesn't. I went where records live. The trustee's office is beige walls, thin carpet, and a receptionist who speaks in calm sentences that make even fire sound procedural. The trustee slid a file across the table and tapped the sale page. We'll publish 3 weeks, he said, pen ready. Do you want to set the opening bid? I looked at the number I'd already done the math on in my kitchen, lamp hissing. Stone from the old wall holding down the pages. Half the unpaid note, I said. The trustee blinked. Most men set it high to scare off bottom feeders. But I wasn't most men. I didn't want theater. I wanted gravity. Half, I repeated. The pen scratched. The date inked itself into a future that had been waiting since my brother laughed by the fence line. Word traveled the way it always does. I felt it in the diner, where men paused their forks midair. At church, where a few handshakes lingered longer. At the hardware counter, where old Avery set a box of fence staples on the counter and didn't charge me for one of them. For your father, he said. I slid exact change across anyway. You don't take charity when you're finishing a line you started as a promise. Mark tried calls first. The voicemails came in a stack, each one shorter, none of them wiser. 6 months, he begged. I can refinance. I can get partners. Then anger. You always wanted to be the martyr. Here's your chance. You'll look like a monster. Then the softest one, the one that told the truth, please. I didn't answer. Not because pain doesn't move me, it does, but because I'd spent 30 years moving so the land could stand. There's a difference. He came to the house 2 days after the last publication. He didn't knock like family. He knocked like a man trying to wake himself up. I opened the door to February breath even though it was late spring. That's what fear does to a room. You can stop this, he said, voice frayed. You of all people, you can stop it. I already did, I said, back when I paid taxes on time for 3 decades. Back when I patched the barn in storms. Back when I honored a will you sold for a laugh. He tried to hold my eyes and couldn't. It was just land. No, I said, calm as the creek. It was a line. He left without a word, shoulders pulling in like sails when wind dies. The gravel under his tires sounded like loose teeth. The week before the sale, the bank called about cash for keys. They wanted to know if I planned to offer it, if I wanted the process to glide instead of grind. I told them I'd think. Mercy shouldn't be improvised. It should be measured. That night, I wrote 2 numbers in the ledger. One was an amount that would move a man out without breaking him in half. The other was a date, circled once. You can be generous and still keep your word with yourself. On the morning of the sale, courthouse steps smelled like old stone warming under a pale sun. The auctioneer held a clipboard, and a voice you could hear over trucks. 5 men gathered, the kind who do this for a living, hats pulled down, eyes quick, a couple of locals who came for the theater, and Mark, late, breathless, a tie throwing color into a scene that didn't want it. I wore my best jacket, the one that fit shoulders made by work. The stone from the wall sat heavy in my pocket, flat as a truth. The trustee read fast, as if naming a weather map. Legal description, deed of trust, default, publication. My name, clear where it mattered. Opening bid, he said, is set at... He named the number I'd chosen. I watched the professionals do math in their heads. You could see them discounting condition, occupancy, unpaid taxes, litigation risk, the sour taste of a local story that could smear a portfolio. 2 of them shook their heads. One stepped back and looked up at the sky the way men do when they're ready to leave. Do I have a bid? The voice asked. I'll take the opening, I said. My pulse didn't move. The words fit in my mouth like something I'd been chewing since winter. A stranger lifted a finger, testing water, and added a token raise, the kind that says, Are you bluffing, old man? I nodded once small, not a nod you'd see from the street, and answered with a number that moved the price a hair, nothing more. He looked at me, saw nothing but a man who had already outlasted him, and lowered his hand. Another bidder cleared his throat, thought about headlines, and decided to keep his cash for something that didn't have a brother in it. Going once, the voice called. The sun made a slow, warm crease across the courthouse door. A bird landed on the railing, looked at us like we were in its way. Going twice. Mark found his voice then. Please, he said to me. Not to the auctioneer, not to the stone, not to the record to me. The word stretched thin and broke at the end. Sold. Oh. The gavel wasn't a gavel, just the flat sound of a shoe on stone, and the low breath the small crowd let out because people need to exhale when a line becomes a wall. The trustee handed me a receipt that weighed more than paper, because some documents carry the heft of the years beneath them. Cashier's checks to the clerk, he said. I'd brought them in a sealed envelope that smelled faintly of the bank's air conditioning. People who think revenge is heat forget how much of it happens in rooms kept cold. Mark didn't move. His tie had gone crooked. His hands were empty. He looked smaller than men are supposed to look on courthouse steps. He opened his mouth, then closed it. It made the same sound my barn makes when winter wants in. I put a business card in his palm, my name, a P.O. box, and a line I'd typed last night with both mercy and boundary in it. If you'd like to exchange keys for consideration, call before Friday at 5. Why? He whispered. There are a lot of questions inside that word. Some I could answer, some I couldn't. Because I'm not you, I said. I walked to the clerk's window and did the small, exact things that make big things real, handed over checks, signed, initialed where tabs showed me to. The clerk's pen squeaked. The receipt curled as the ink dried. Out in the square, a truck backfired. Pigeons lifted, circled, came back. Life kept behaving like life. Driving home, the ridge rose ahead of me, the same line it has always been. The creek threw light back at the sky. In the kitchen, I set the trustee's receipt under the old stone. The stack beneath it had grown tax cards, notices, letters that began Dear Borrower and ended with my name, sales certificate whose language was drier than any sermon but twice as binding. I poured coffee that had been waiting on a warmer, black and mean. It cooled the anger I didn't need anymore. The phone rang the next morning. He didn't say his name, didn't need to. What would you offer for the keys? His voice had lost everything but the edges you need to make numbers. I told him the amount I'd written in the ledger. Silence. Then, that's not enough. It's enough to leave steady, I said. It's not enough to pretend nothing happened. He made a sound I couldn't place, part laugh, part flinch. You always like speeches. I like paper, I said. Bring the keys Friday at noon. Bring your dignity too. You'll need both. He came on time. The house smelled like lemon cleaner and something else air that had learned a lesson. He'd emptied the closets, boxed the pieces of himself that still wanted to believe there were shortcuts that weren't cliffs. He set the keys on the counter and kept his eyes on the grain of the wood. I counted the bills the way men count fence posts out loud, fingertip on every edge. I slid an envelope across. He slid the keys. For a second, he tried to close his hand on mine like we were boys again under a sky that didn't know us yet. I didn't pull away. I didn't grip back. You win, he said, not looking up. No, I said. I remember. That's different. He picked up the envelope, tucked it into a coat that had lost its swagger, and left without turning around. The door clicked shut. It sounded like a lid on a box you finally filled right. I walked the room slow. The new kitchen island gleamed like something that had never learned modesty. The hallway had a scuff where a piece of furniture had fought the wall. In the master bedroom, the window looked toward the ridge. I opened it. Air came in cool, leaf-sweet, clean. The house seemed to breathe out. On the porch, I sat with the keys warm in my palm and thought of the title that had written itself before any of us were born. My brother laughed when he sold my land. It finished itself in the quiet, not as a shout, not as a trumpet, but as a fact. And I laughed harder when I bought his house for half. Not out loud, not cruel. Just the kind of laugh that happens behind the eyes when gravity does what gravity does. That night, I didn't sleep in the house. I went back to my own kitchen, set the keys on the table beside the stone, and wrote one line in the ledger under my father's last entry. Line honored. The lamp hissed. The creek murmured. The ridge held its shape in the dark. In the morning, I'd call the locksmith, the insurance, the utility. There's a rhythm to aftermath, and I've always been good at rhythms. I'd decide later whether I'd sell or rent or hold, whether mercy had another measure left in it for him, or whether the lesson would need more quiet. You don't decide big things on the day you win them. You let the air settle. You drink your coffee. You listen for what the house wants to be under your name. Out back, a bird made the quick, three-note call it makes when rain is coming. I looked up and tasted it in the air, the clean promise of it. Somewhere, a screen door creaked. Somewhere else, a man told a story to make himself the hero. The town would go on the way towns do. I laid my palm on the stone, felt its cool certainty, and understood this season was ending the way good seasons should. With work done, tools cleaned, a line trued. And ahead, I could already see the next season's shape quieter, yes, but not empty. Because after downfall comes resolution, and resolution, like everything worth keeping, arrives in silence. The day after the sale, the town moved on. That's the way of things trains run. Milk spoils, dogs bark whether a man's house belongs to him or not. But Mark didn't move on. He moved down. I saw it in the diner where his chair stayed empty for 3 days straight. Saw it at church where his pew sat hollow, hymnals untouched. The world kept turning. He was the one stuck. Humiliation had burned him, but losing the house was salt poured on the wound. Neighbors whispered, soft as wind. He's renting now, can you believe it? Sold his truck too, swapped it for a beater. For a man like Mark, who built himself out of appearances, losing the stage meant losing the script. And a man without a script is just a shadow looking for light. One evening, I drove by the small duplex he'd moved into. The blinds were crooked, porch light burnt out. His wife sat outside on the steps, cigarette glowing red against the dusk. She didn't look up. Inside, I caught a glimpse, boxes stacked, paint chipped, Mark sitting in a lawn chair because there wasn't real furniture yet. He stared at the floor, hands clasped, no television on, no sound. Just a man waiting for silence to loosen its grip, not realizing it never does. That night, I wrote in my ledger, house returned, dignity unpaid. The town didn't forget. Small places never do. People measure you by what you do when the wind changes. They'd watched him laugh at selling land he never worked. They'd seen me say nothing, year after year, until the paper itself spoke louder than both of us. Now they looked at him different. Not with anger, anger fades, but with something worse. Pity. I caught the barber one morning saying, he used to brag about that house. Now he won't even drive down Main Street. Pity strips a man faster than rage. Rage means you still matter. Pity means you've already been buried. Mark tried, of course. Tried to claw back image. He told folks he was downsizing, that he chose to sell. But lies taste different when truth sits on the courthouse wall. And the town had already chewed on the truth. When he boasted too loud, silence met him. When he laughed too sharp, no one echoed it. And when he sat alone, no one offered him a chair. I didn't need to say a word. The whole town had become my silence. One night, I found him waiting in my driveway. His car was dented, paint dull, headlights dim. He stood by the hood, hands shoved deep in his pockets. I need to know, he said when I stepped out, lamplight spilling from my porch. Did you enjoy it, watching me lose everything? I studied him. His face was thinner, lines deeper, pride eroded. I didn't enjoy it, I said. Enjoyment's for games. This was correction. He shook his head, laughed once short, broken. Correction. You sound like father. I let that sit between us, heavy. Then maybe you should have listened when he spoke. He stared at me for a long time, eyes glassy, jaw working like he wanted to spit but couldn't find saliva. Then he climbed back into his car, door slamming hollow. The engine coughed, caught, and carried him away. From then on, he avoided me. If he saw me on Main, he crossed to the other sidewalk. If I walked into the diner, he left change on the counter and slipped out. He lived like a shadow afraid of light. A man cut down not by violence but by ledger lines. And I breathed easier. Not with triumph, not with pride. Just easier. The kind of breath a man takes after finishing a long day's work, knowing the fence is straight, the roof patched, the cattle fed. Because revenge, when done right, feels less like fire and more like completion. Still, I never gloated. Never stood in town declaring victory. Didn't need to. His downfall wasn't my boast, it was his own echo. What I did was simple. I lived. I planted beans where the old fence line used to be. Walked the ridge each evening, listening to the creek. Paid taxes early. Stacked the receipts neat, stone holding them steady. Neighbors nodded at me now with respect, not pity. Children waved from porches. Men offered me coffee without asking for favors in return. The town remembered who had stayed silent and who had mocked. One summer afternoon, I sat on my porch, bourbon in hand, when a breeze carried laughter from down the road, children playing by the creek. It was light, innocent, the kind of laughter that heals instead of wounds. I thought then of Mark's laughter, sharp and cruel the day he sold the land, and of my own, silent and inward, the day I bought his house for half. 2 laughs, both gone now, replaced by children's voices carried on wind. I raised my glass, not in gloating, but in closure. The line had held. The wall still stood. The ledger was balanced. Mark had fallen, not by my hand, but by his own weight. I had only let gravity do its work. That was his downfall. Not a collapse in fire, but a steady sinking into silence he could not outshout. And mine was not triumph. It was release. Because sometimes revenge isn't about making noise. It's about waiting long enough for silence to speak louder than any laugh. The house was mine. Not just on paper, not just in the courthouse, but in fact, the day the sheriff's office recorded the deed into my name, I drove out and parked by the mailbox that still bore Mark's last name in fading paint. For a long moment, I didn't get out. I just sat there, hand resting on the steering wheel, watching the porch where my brother had once strutted, laughing too loud, showing off his new jacket and truck. Now the porch sagged a little. The paint peeled at the edges. A wasp nest clung under the eaves. The house itself looked tired, like it knew the fight was over. I stepped out and walked slow. The gravel crunched beneath my boots, steady, measured. In my pocket, the old stone from the wall weighed heavier than keys. I pushed the door open. The smell hit me first, not foul, just empty. A house without pride smells different than one full of life. Lemon cleaner lingered, but underneath was something hollow, as if air had stopped believing it belonged to anyone. The kitchen gleamed too much, counters polished like a showroom. But I knew those surfaces carried debt, not dignity. I ran my hand across the cool marble, the same way I once ran it along fence posts. One had been earned, the other borrowed. The difference sat in my chest like iron. Room by room I walked the house. The living room, with its oversized television and couches too new to sag. The dining room, table empty, chairs too stiff for family meals. Upstairs, the master bedroom closet doors half open, faint shadows where pictures once hung. I opened a drawer in the nightstand. Inside lay a folded receipt from a furniture store dated 2 years prior. No interest for 24 months. I let it fall back into the drawer. Debt has a smell too, faint but sharp, like ozone before a storm. On the windowsill of the smallest bedroom, I found a child's toy left behind, a plastic soldier, one arm missing. I turned it in my hand, thought of the laughter that once filled this room, now traded for silence. Mark had lost more than a house. He lost a stage where he performed his version of life. And now the stage was mine, not because I wanted it, but because gravity had brought it here. I didn't sleep there that first night. The house wasn't ready for sleep. Instead, I locked the door, pocketed the keys, and drove back to my own place, the kitchen that still smelled of wood smoke, the ridge that had carried me through every season. At my table, I set the new keys beside the stone. The lamp hissed, steady as breath. I opened the ledger and wrote a single line. The house stands, the line holds, the season turns. Then I closed the book and sat in silence. In town, folks looked at me differently now. Respect mixed with something else, caution, maybe, or awe. They spoke to me softer, shook my hand firmer. Dennis said, "You did what most men only dream. You didn't swing a fist. You just waited." I answered, "I didn't wait for revenge. I waited for truth." But even as I said it, I knew the two had become one. Mark kept his distance. He passed me once on Main Street, eyes darting, lips pressed tight. He looked smaller, not just in body but in spirit. His shadow seemed shorter. He no longer laughed. And in a way, that was my final victory. Because revenge doesn't always sound like triumph. Sometimes it sounds like the absence of the very laugh that once cut you open. The house became a choice. Neighbors asked, "What will you do with it? Rent it? Sell?" I said nothing for weeks. I walked the rooms at dusk, letting light spill across the floorboards, listening to the creaks, the sighs. I opened windows and let air move again. I placed the plastic soldier back on the sill, a silent reminder. One evening, standing at the upstairs window, I looked out at the ridge where our father once stood with his transit. From there, you could still see the line of the stone wall, solid, straight, eternal. The house wasn't mine to boast about. It was mine to correct. And correction doesn't happen in noise. It happens in silence. That summer, I planted a small garden in the backyard. Tomatoes, beans, squash. I knelt in soil Mark had never touched, pressed seeds into earth that had outlasted his laughter. Each sprout that pushed through was a quiet vindication. Children from next door peeked over the fence. I handed them tomatoes when they ripened, warm from the sun. Their laughter was lighter than his had ever been. The house was no longer a monument to Mark's pride. It was becoming part of the land again, and that, I realized, was the truest revenge. Not owning his downfall, but reclaiming the silence he wasted. That was how I began to close the circle. Not with speeches, not with gloating, but with a quiet garden, with a soldier on a windowsill, with a stone on my table holding steady the pages of a ledger that would outlast us both. The house, the land, the silence, they were mine now. And Mark? He was left with his own echo, fading each day, until nothing of him remained but the memory of a laugh that cost him everything. The house stood quiet for weeks. I didn't rush to fill it, didn't rush to sell. Some things need stillness before they tell you what they want to be. Every evening after supper, I'd drive over, unlock the door, and walk the room slow. My boots echoed on floors that remembered too much noise. The walls had absorbed years of hollow laughter, arguments muffled behind doors, and the bitter silence of a family fraying. Now, those same walls listened to nothing but my measured steps and the steady creak of hinges. It felt less like moving into a house, more like laying a spirit to rest. One night, I sat on the porch, the keys heavy in my palm. The air smelled of lilac, carried from a neighbor's yard. Across the way, children chased each other, laughter ringing light. I leaned back, let the chair rock, and thought about the ledger of my life. For years, sacrifice filled it. Then betrayal, then humiliation, then countermove. Now it held resolution. I pulled the stone from my pocket, set it on the porch rail. Moonlight touched its rough edges. I remembered Father lifting stones like this one, building a wall that outlasted him. A wall Mark never saw value in, but one that taught me everything I needed about permanence. You were right, Father, I whispered into the dark. Lines don't move, people do. The wind carried my words into the trees. The townsfolk grew used to the change. At the diner, conversations drifted back to weather and crops. At church, hymns rose without cracks. People nodded at me not just with respect, but with acceptance, as if the story had ended, and I was simply a man again, not a figure of whispered justice. Dennis said to me one Sunday, "World set straight now, Rich. You can rest." I smiled, small. Rest comes later. For now, there's living. Mark? He faded. He lived across town in a rented place with curtains always drawn. Sometimes I caught glimpses at the gas station, at the grocery store. His shoulders slumped, eyes shadowed. He looked past me, not at me. His laugh never returned. And in that silence, I heard the truest closure. I didn't need to punish him further. Silence had done the work. Paper had drawn the line. Time had enforced it. All that remained was to honor it. I made a choice that summer, not to sell, not yet. The house would stand under my name, but not as a trophy. As a lesson, I stripped it of what wasn't real, the over-polished counters, the debt-ridden furniture. I left the walls bare, the floors plain. I let air move through open windows, and in the yard I built a bench from old barn wood, set it by the garden I planted. Tomatoes climbed stakes, beans twisted high, squash spread low. It looked nothing like the manicured pride Mark once showed off. It looked alive. Children came again, hands reaching for sun-warmed fruit. I gave freely. Their laughter filled spaces that once echoed with false bravado. It felt like the house itself sighed, grateful to be returned to earth instead of ego. One evening, I sat on that bench as the sun dipped behind the ridge. Shadows stretched long, the creek hummed low, the pines whispered. I pulled out the ledger, placed it on my knees. I flipped through pages Father's handwriting, mine layered after. Debts paid, repairs made, seasons recorded, betrayals endured. At the very back, in fresh ink, I wrote the last entry. The line honored, the ledger closed, the season complete. I set the stone on the page, closed the book, and felt the weight of 30 years lift. Revenge hadn't been fire. It hadn't been fist or shouting. It had been patience, silence, and truth allowed to ripen. Mark had laughed when he sold my land. I had laughed harder, though quieter, when I bought his house for half. Not because I took joy in his pain, but because justice, when it finally comes, has its own kind of laugh. The kind you don't hear out loud, but feel deep, steady, unshakable. It isn't cruel. It isn't loud. It's permanent. That night, I left the house unlocked. Let the summer air wander through. Let crickets sing in the corners. It no longer needed to be guarded. I went home to my kitchen, set the stone back on its place on the table, and blew out the lamp. For the first time in decades, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt free.